Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Natalie Moore. I'm a reporter at Chicago Public Radio, WBEZ, and I'm the moderator today. And I'm pleased to introduce our panel. We'll be talking about mapping COVID-19 recovery, mapping equity to drive impactful philanthropy. Immediately next to me is Beth Swanson, who is with A Better Chicago. And next to her is Angelique Power, who used to be at the Field Foundation in Chicago and is now with the Skillman Foundation in Detroit. And then on the end is Maria Pesqueira, who is with Healthy Communities Foundation. So we're going to be visual this afternoon so you can understand what mapping COVID inequality looks like. So we're going to spend some time with some slides, then I'll ask some questions, and then we'll turn it over to you for questions. And with that, I will turn it over to Angelique.
Thank you. I don't think I have a button.
I'll push it up.
Okay. I can map COVID, but I can't turn on a microphone. That's great. So in the summer of 2020, when the pandemic was relatively new, when many of us were watching the murder of George Floyd over and over again on our phones, on our news channels, many of us were sitting in our homes, sitting inside of ourselves, asking ourselves questions about, like, how do you even create change? Truthfully, no one sector or one role is able to own the chalice of achieving change. There are roles that each of us play. Sometimes it's the role of the uprisings that are happening in the streets, and sometimes it's the role that many of us play as warriors inside of our institutions, trying to push for change or hold our institutions accountable. In 2020, as those uprisings were the drumbeat for many of our weekly Zoom meetings that we were in, some of us were studying the racialized outcomes of COVID, and we were sitting in meetings with people within the private sector, the philanthropic sector, the public sector, trying to solve for COVID, but seemingly trying to do so without a grounding in the racialized history, in the lack of investment in certain communities, and in the role that, frankly, we played in creating those racialized outcomes. And so this is when the notion of mapping COVID, the actual causes of COVID and the actual crisis that we were facing came to be. The premise is we cannot solve our way out of this moment blindfolded. And in order to rectify history, rather than repeat it, we have to actually have a racialized analysis on what has happened. So today I'm going to walk through some of those slides with you. I'm not sharing the full presentation, but as you can see, if you want to see the entire presentation, you can go to mappingcovid19equity.org, and we've actually created it so that you can download any of these slides, and it's really easy to replicate this anywhere in the country. So while the three of us were actually the earliest co-founders, kind of came to the table together to say, let's do this project, it quickly grew to almost 30 organizations in Chicago that agreed to work on it. And these are private foundations, these are academic institutions, other nonprofits. We met weekly for 6 months. We formed 2 different subgroups, one a communication subgroup and one a data collection subgroup. And no one was paid to be part of this project. Often with researchers, you pay them, you have sort of like a notion that you want them to follow up on. There are different research institutions that came forward, lent their expertise and their institutional resources for this. We always start with the premise of how problematic mapping projects can be. And we know that there is no universal objective view, and also that often those that are most harmed are left out of maps. So the formerly incarcerated, as well as undocumented, routinely do not show up on maps. That said, we had 4 main uses in mind when we created these. One, we wanted to equip organizers. And so most of the information that we share from foundations in this mapping project is private information. and isn't released. And so we wanted to equip organizers who are looking to hold foundations accountable with access to information that they could not ordinarily get. We also wanted to equip investors who are looking to really fund differently with an interactive mapping tool that they could use. We wanted to inform not just those that are in the public sector, but many of us are invited to sit at policy tables with the public sector to plan. Rarely it's those most harmed by policies, so we wanted to actually have an example of inequitable policies that could be used in resetting policies post-COVID. And then, as I mentioned before, another group was around data, and one of the usages we hoped for is to standardize data collection. There have been some really great sessions on that here, but right now we don't really have a customized way or a universal way of understanding BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color. So what's a BIPOC organization? What does that mean? Many foundations don't ask for this information, so we can't report out on this information, so we can't be held accountable to this information. So this is our working thesis. Policies and lack of investment created a tinderbox. And what we really wanted to say was that COVID is like this current match, but there absolutely will be other matches, so we can't solve for COVID. We actually have to solve for the tinderbox that we created through policies and lack of investment. Why should you care? You know, the argument like this is the important thing to do, or like we learned the lessons of COVID, that doesn't really go very far. And so we offer the idea of symbiosis, that as shown by COVID, if I am sick, then you are sick. And conversely, if you thrive, then I thrive. And so how do we actually embed this notion of symbiosis into future planning? I'm going to go through a quick sampling. Again, this is only a small sample of the slides. We chose Cook County. So for Chicago area people, the reason this is significant is that we didn't just focus on a city. And often that's what research is focused on, and resources. We wanted to actually combine small towns, rural areas, suburbs, and a city to look at how COVID has had an impact. And what I'll say is that this is a highly segregated area, like many other areas. So white families are showing up in yellow, Black families in blue, and Latinx families in green. Then we mapped the racialized impact of COVID lifetime. And then we moved to talk about how the policies play a role in this racialized impact, and that we have our own culpability. The black lines that you see is a study area. So we introduced a study area, watch the black lines as we move. This study area are communities that are 85% or more BIPOC, and 25% or more live below the poverty line, in the city, outside of the city. When you talk about inequitable policies, you usually start with housing. And so what we looked at here, the red dots represent redlining, and you can see that 80% of our study area today still is underpinned by redlining that happened decades ago. And we know that home ownership is a fundamental building block, not just in generational wealth, but we are coming to understand it as a fundamental building block in generational health. This represents education policy. In Chicago, 50 schools were closed, and you can see that the majority of them are closed within the study area. This is not to say that there is no investment happening in the study area. We wanted to clock how much money is actually poured into incarceration rates, policing, et cetera. With this slide, we wanted to combat the notion where when you were hearing about COVID, you were hearing about people who were obese or who had high blood pressure. And what we wanted to do was show the link between poverty and these conditions, because poverty is the pre-existing condition. We call this slide 3, 2, 1. We took a snapshot of COVID, and what you see is that while there are major clusters that are inside of the study area, they do not stay there. Again, if you are sick, I am sick. Here, the green clusters represent where the health centers are in Cook County. You can note the contrast between the study area and where people can seek health care. The pattern repeats itself with mental health care access, with fresh food options. And we have lots more slides on that, but then we pivoted to looking at the public sector. And there are different slides on this too, but I think a good example of what we looked at was, okay, so the PPP loans, how did that go? With our study area, well, almost completely missed our study area. And yet, in Cook County, the suburban Cook County CARES Act dollars were given with a racial equity lens. And so that's the bottom squiggly square down there. And I don't know if you could see on that slide, but there's actually much more investment that was done because of that racialized lens. We flip to philanthropy, and this is the private data. We not only helped foundations to collect data in a uniform way around BIPOC grant making, but then we looked at how many of those dollars went to the study area in the year before COVID hit. And you can see very few dollars were directed into that area. Now, you've seen all of the evidence about inequitable policies and all the evidence about the issues that have been mounting, but very few dollars were actually directed there. This happened just in the first few months of COVID, where we clocked the COVID shift, where suddenly foundations were actually directing funds into BIPOC communities. They were reporting out on where their portfolio was going. They were looking outside of the city as well as inside of the city. And with that, I'll turn it to Beth.
Thank you, Angelique. So Beth Swanson, I'm CEO of A Better Chicago, and we wanted to give an example of sort of how all of this collective work really impacted our own work at A Better Chicago and changed sort of how we do business. We are a venture nonprofit philanthropy, which means we are raising, pooling, and investing funds in what we believe to be some of the most highly effective, highly impactful organizations that help young people out of poverty. So if you go to the next slide, that is us. I just said that, that's okay. So one thing I want to say, a bit of context, I started as CEO in 2019, and we went through sort of a refresh in our strategic vision and how we were going to do our work. We obviously did not predict a pandemic to happen in 2020, but what we started to do is we made a strategic decision in 2019 to really explicitly invest in leaders and organization most proximate to the issues we sought to address. And so we were looking to invest in BIPOC leaders embedded on the south and west sides of Chicago. These geographies are home to not only the deepest pockets of urban poverty, in the city of Chicago, but really nationally. So when we started this work, it just fueled and helped our transition and evolution into this work, so to just be so much, more quick to respond to those needs. So the first was the Emergency Relief Fund that we raised and invested over $2.5 million over that summer of 2020. Invested in 47 organizations on the south and west sides. You can see where the orange dots are. It's hard to see, but originally our core grantees prior to that, when I started in 2019, are the purple. So right sort of centered downtown. What we did is, we really shifted and then carried this work forward as we continued our work. But the COVID mapping, really, that data was then embedded into our process of finding, selecting, and investing in these organizations. And again, we did direct financial support, essential goods, innovative educational programming, because as everyone, all children were swiftly put into a hybrid or online learning situation and needed additional resources, computers, et cetera. So that was the Emergency Relief Fund. If we can go to the next slide. So two other things I'd like to highlight is, our latest investments. So the pandemic was a moment in time. So we had Emergency Relief Fund, we had the COVID mapping project, et cetera, but we didn't want that just to be one moment in time. We really wanted to influence our work going forward. And so we continue to use that data And we've embedded it into our investment decision-making process. And we've also gotten closer to the communities that we want to support and their voices as well into our processes. Two things I will highlight. So the map to the left is 2019. Our portfolio actually was at the end of 2018, and then the 2022 current portfolio. As you can see, we're going deeper on both west and south side again, leveraging this collective work and the expertise. So not only the data that was collected, but really the expertise of our colleagues. As we thought about, evolving our work, we were predominantly focused on education back in 2018 and 19. Obviously, that's a critical lever to help young people. But we also thought about the education-adjacent issues or the other essential needs. One needs to be successful. If a child living in poverty lives in a very complex diagram of issues, and we wanted to take on more of the circles of that Venn diagram. And leveraging expertise, like to the women on my left, and others in this collective work, we were able to really make smarter strategic decisions to get resources to the young people and to nonprofits that weren't necessarily on traditional radars, if you will. So we have one fund that we call the Catalyst Fund. It funds community-embedded organizations, innovative approaches, sort of very early-stage work, priority placed on BIPOC-led organizations, often nonprofits that have been historically overlooked by institutional philanthropy. Our supports, we help them design, codify their model, articulate their impact, and really build the infrastructure and hopefully the funding longevity to really grow and then become, one of those organizations that is on more traditional radars, if you will. As you can see, the west side is where we've been leaning in over the last couple of years. We're now bringing on some new cohorts of organizations on the south side. Will be announced later this year. And then there was one other I would mention before turning to Maria, is we also, coming out of the relief work in 2020, it was interesting, again, to be in these collective conversations with city leaders, with philanthropists, and there wasn't a lot of discussion, at least that we heard, about what should we be doing that's different for children given this time and the layers and layers of trauma that they've gone through. What we heard was fights about getting children just back into buildings or back to the way it was. And so we launched another initiative, again, sort of fueled by these conversations and this data around how do we think of what should be, what are the supports we need, and what we heard from leaders in community, families, young people through that work was things I'm sure we all know at this point, right? It's social emotional learning, it's trauma-informed teaching and learning and care and supports and whole wellness initiatives. And so we were able to also pivot our investments to include those types of things based on what we heard from these conversations, these communities. And so the investments aren't just the same types of investments and now just more on the south and west side, but they're also the investments that ourselves are evolving, and I think much more impactful given the work we were able to collectively do with each other. So with that, I will stop there and let Maria share about her work as well.
Okay. Could you hear me? Yes. Thanks, Beth. The Healthy Communities Foundation, we're a health conversion foundation that serves a 27 zip code region in the Chicago and western suburbs of Cook County. Being a health conversion foundation means that we're a foundation that was created from a sale of a local hospital that was a nonprofit that sold to a for-profit. And as a result, those resources are meant to create an endowment that is meant to be meant to target the needs of that community. In 2018, our foundation, with new leadership and a refined focus on advancing health equity, saw this as an opportunity to really address the health disparities in our region. As I mentioned, our foundation is both in the city of Chicago proper, as well as the outlying area of Chicago, which is in western Cook County. Go next one. Well, when COVID hit, so let's think back Let's go back a little before COVID hit, pre-pandemic. Communities in our region were already experiencing great health inequities, which is why our foundation looked to address health disparities from that lens of really looking at the zip codes as a whole. What we did was early on, we took an approach of looking at the rankings of these 27 zip codes from the county ranking process, and it basically ranked all of the zip codes in our region from the lens of what are considered to be the healthiest zip codes and least healthiest. What was really interesting is that using the county health ranking method, if we took a look at the zip code that borders, that happens to border one of the healthiest county in the nation, you could see that happens to be the healthiest, and then look across the board. So if we could go to the next slide. Great, right here. So if you take a look at this region, at the map that's here, when COVID hit, those circled in red were among the top 5 communities with the highest COVID cases. And as I was mentioning it, pre-pandemic, communities in our region that were experiencing the greatest health inequities are represented by the green here in our service region map. Across our entire region, the majority of our region happens to be predominantly Latino. Our entire region is about the size of the city of Milwaukee, population-wise. Our region has more Latinos or the amount of Latinos similar to the size of San Diego, for example, and El Paso. That's how many Latinos living in this particular region. If we can go to the next slide. So the opportunity was there. Our board seized this moment and felt challenged to shift from a rapid response to more of a strategic, long-term investment approach to address why the pandemic hit some of our communities versus others. We turned to community, especially those that have been the hardest hit or were the hardest hit, and asked about their immediate and emerging health needs. So we are a health foundation that is meant to address the needs of this community. Let's hear from the community is the approach. This one has informed us about our COVID response investments, which have ranged from what we called shovel-ready to time-sensitive crisis approaches. We also implemented a multi-year general operating support in 21. We had planned on supporting general operating early on, but really kicked off this multi-year approach quicker as a result of the need to accelerate at that moment. And in 21, our total commitments of grants went to a 70% increase compared to our total funding in 2019. So the opportunities that these maps have offered has helped us truly see how the social determinants of health play a role in how COVID has deepened the inequities. It's offered us a cross-sector opportunity to deepen relationships with communities and understand the hyperlocal needs. If we did listen earlier, we may not have seen such a devastating impact, is what we've come to realize. While we call this the match, as Angelique mentioned earlier, this is our moment to really think about what other potential matches are there, and if we do not see this opportunity to learn from these systemic inequities, then certainly there could be another match lit. So what we also have learned is that we need to have trust with community to address what's happening at a hyperlocal and fund those needs from that equitable perspective. So here it is, certainly, as our board saw this as an opportunity to invest, it's also the opportunity to reimagine what public health and accountability looks like. So the maps have given us a historical context and a snapshot in the time of the health state of communities, but it's also given us an opportunity to hold ourselves accountable to communities historically overlooked and disinvested because of racist policies and systems. We certainly need to move beyond rapid response and only responding in a time of crisis. And how can we invest for long-term change? And what needs to change in our processes to be ready for a future of public health crisis is a question that we must continue to ask ourselves. So as philanthropy responded in this time of crisis, we need to ensure that this was not a one-time investment, but that is a long-term approach. Thanks.
Thank you for those slides and for that context. I love the line that was in there, policies and lack of investment led to a tinderbox. Each of you work in these communities, you have connections, so we knew that segregation in these policies were going to make COVID worse than it already was. But as you were mapping and looking at the data, was there anything that you didn't know? What did you learn from this project about some of the communities?
Well, I would say that there isn't a lot in here that we didn't necessarily know. I think that when we tend to look at maps like this, we tend to focus just on the past, what's gone wrong, and admire the problem. And so there are two things that I think that this project was able to do and that we hope it can do. One, even though all of this information is true for Cook County and is true for many of the places where each of you live, the reality is that we come at problems as if they are brand new. We don't actually talk about like our role in creating these problems, and we don't change our institutions. We don't change the type, who gets to sit at the table to do policy creation. Most often it's sectors that have created the most damage that are creating solutions to the problems. So we're hoping that we actually open the door so that this type of data is shared. There's no private sector area on here because we couldn't get the information from the private sector. We got information about grants that were given and volunteers that showed up, and that was it.
What kind of private sector information would you have wanted?
So it's not statistically significant, but we wanted to know like how many employees came from the study area. How many like of these companies actually hired people that live in Chicago and Cook County? How much were they investing besides in grants to create outposts of their banks or other things that they do? We showed you the fresh food slide, but actually finding out like the dollars that are invested to grow the economic power in these communities, that is a huge part of the solution to remove the tinderbox. So those are things that I think we started to get to.
Yeah, I would add that I agree that I don't think any of us were surprised, but it went from sort of we understood it or kind of knew it or assumed it to just having it just start put on slides was really helpful to fuel conversations that some may not want to have, whether it's in the corporate sector, et cetera. And you know, the PPP loan stands out to me still of just how not a dollar, according to the data, sort of flowed to that, our study area. And so that to me just helped us become more urgent in our work to make sure our investments were going. So I mentioned this, that the trying to get young people back into school or learning, and that really fueled a fire in us to put out that we did a Chicago Design Challenge was the initiative. It's over $7 million, and it was going to be invested in multi-year grants to 8 organizations now that we asked to, as a part of that, you needed to be serving young people in that study area. We asked for them to give ideas that infused community input to wanting those, in those areas, things like that. So I think it just drove us to do more with the leverage and the dollars and the resources we have, because it was just so stark. It was just, I guess, that catalyst we needed, that further push.
And I would also add how these maps continue to stress the social and structural determinants of health. And that while health is one piece and health access is one piece, housing, the access to the internet access, during this time of the pandemic, folks who were not even able to get online to get their children in class virtually. So all these other structural determinants and social determinants of health were certainly, while we knew existed prior, we've seen how it connects to one's health and well-being.
How did you share this data with residents and communities, with community organizations, and what was the level of engagement that you had?
We actually had a committee, that was the function of the communications committee, was to go out in teams and try to share. This was during the pandemic, so we weren't out in community, but we were sharing it with folks. The city had formed a racial equity rapid response committee, and so there were about 40 community leaders that were a part of it. We shared it with that group. We also met with organizers that we fund, and so we shared it with them so that they could kick the tires, ask for more, say, this is what I need to use it for. And to your other question, it's the proactive piece. I was just thinking in my head, most of us are like waiting for the backlash to the ARP dollars now. Like, we know that it's like coming, Why wasn't it used this way? Why didn't it solve all the problems in schools in particular? And so that is a piece of the mapping project too, is to like continually change narrative around what the structural issues look like and what, played into it. So these short-term infusions of cash are not going to change the systemic issues.
Maria, how did you all do community engagement?
So going back to community engagement and being community informed is certainly key. And if we think about the pandemic and how communities were able to respond, it needed a hyper-local approach. It was basically, as we think about the community health workers, the promotoras, if we think the individuals that folks had felt a sense of trust in, were the ones that people responded to, whether it was to get vaccinated, whether to know where to go and access food, where to access services. So being community informed, it was absolutely key, but from a local, hyper-local perspective. So we at the Healthy Communities Foundation depend on our community partners, and it was really clear that those community partners that were rooted to the ground were the ones who were able to best respond and help address those systemic needs of the communities.
I've listened to you all talk about how you changed some of your funding. Did you have to get board approval? Did you have to get staff buy-in? Was that hard to, you recognized the change that was needed and you did it. Was it easy to make those changes?
Yeah, I think to address this, because if there was ever a time that showed the need to invest in communities because of the symbiotic nature that the pandemic showed, that my health is connected to your health and your health is connected to my health, all of a sudden, everyone became aware of how important it was to address this pandemic and to respond to the needs of communities. At least in our case with our board, we're not a huge foundation. We're a local community health conversion foundation with substantial resources, mind you, but yet we are not one of the big 5 or 3 in the country. And yet our board, when we had our plan, how we were going to address this, We had one particular board member who said, "This is the moment. We are here to respond to community." And so it was no longer, let's stick to that 5%. And mind you, foundations normally only need to respond to 5% of their endowment on an annual basis, and our foundation was always be above the 5%. So I would say that most boards across the country, even the most conservative ones, felt this moment and this need. But it was, I think the issue is, how can we respond across the board from general operating to having a trust that's in place with community partners is absolutely what was key. But we didn't have that problem.
We didn't either. I mean, so in 2019, as I mentioned, we refreshed our strategy. It's always our mission and vision always it remained the same. As young people living in poverty was our focus, but we already made the sort of decision evolution, and the board was leading the charge of wanting to have more impact, wanting to be more proximate to the issues, wanting to be investing in, like I said, BIPOC leaders on the South and West Side. So the timing for us, that was all put in place, board, leadership council, we have a number of different layers of governance, were all bought in. And so, and really leading the charge. So when this happened, it was, instead of, I think, having the more typical change management over the next couple of years, we will evolve in these ways and these milestones. Instead, it was like, game on, we're gonna live into this right now, starting in March 2020. So to us, it just sped up the change, but the agreement and the understanding that this is where we needed to be and this is the work we should be doing was already there.
I think philanthropy was scared. And I think that the power shifted, and
And what were they scared of?
because you have to keep in mind uprisings were happening everywhere, that art institutions were being pulled to their feet, not by the donor, but by the lowest paid employee. Monuments were toppling. This was a moment where power had shifted tremendously, and the, standard operating practice inside of foundations is structural racism, and they were called on the carpet. And so this is usually behind the scenes, like major, in Chicago, the Chicago Community Trust did the COVID Recovery Fund, I think that's what it was called, with the United Way. Every time a tranche of funding went out, it was reported where it went. And people were like, like quickly calculating it and able to say where it was going. The first tranche was not actually equitable, and they heard about it. And so then it flipped the script, and funders knew they had to not just be reactive to like who knows how to apply, that funders couldn't just like to report to their boards what they were doing, that they were being held accountable, and that they actually had to look at their portfolio and look at the city, hence the mapping project, and say like, does our funding, is it going to the people who are the most visionary, who are the people who live in the most impacted areas? And if it isn't, then let's remove applications. Let's go find people. Let's call them on the phone and be like, you don't even need to apply. We're just going to give you $50,000. People are like, who is this? Suddenly foundations were like funding people in a different way. The challenge is, does that continue now?
Well, that was my next question. How does this shift continue? And will there be pressure to go back to, we keep hearing about go back to normal. Well, I mean, I think we want some things to be normal, like to socialize safely.
Like ride the L, like
Yeah.
that's a whole other conversation.
But a lot of things should not go back to normal. So at least from the philanthropic standpoint, will you all be able to keep the changes that you have implemented?
I can speak for our organization. I think there's two, we're pulling all of this work forward. And, it's just, again, it was strategically how we were moving forward. This just accelerated our movement on these issues. But I think it's more difficult to answer your question on like philanthropy in general. You know, there have been some great relationships built through this work too that I think will continue, and we will continue to share data and understanding and help each other and inform each other's work. And I see more collaborative efforts now than I've seen in I think quite some time. However, on the accountability side, you know, we are refreshing all the data now. So you know, now that it's been a bit, we've come back together, and the Community Trust is actually doing that. In putting it all together, and we'll have another set of slides to see, are we maintaining this? Like, did that shift of dollars in 2020, is it going right back to where it was, or is it gonna stay going forward? So we will have that data soon. But it's hard, I think, to hold philanthropy accountable, even when you're in it, because it's an industry that's not, as you said, known for its transparency. You know, it's now being pushed that way, which is, I think, you know, a good thing, but it's the accountability is where it's tough.
Yeah, and I've got to say that there are different initiatives or that have taken place, or different movements that are taking place in philanthropy. There's the Trust Philanthropy Project that I would encourage you all to take a look at, that really looks at how to build a trust-based approach within philanthropy, and holding to be more transparent, and to hold ourselves accountable to create less red tape. I mean, we saw how quickly funding money could come out into communities, because communities were in need, and someone's health was related to another person's health. Let's continue to see it that way, that my well-being, the well-being of my community, is just as important in the well-being of other communities across the sector. So I would say that I believe that there are structures being put in place, and it's important for communities to hold philanthropy accountable. You know, as Angelique mentioned, there was fear. Let's ensure that that we continue to place the understanding that philanthropy does need to continue to be transparent.
Yeah, I would say no. I don't think it's going to continue unless there's sustained pressure and real long-term changes. This was like crisis mode, get money out the door, but there are problems within philanthropy, from metrics that are insane and impossible, to having, you know, a rubric of what makes a good, sustainable nonprofit, to even just giving to nonprofits. I mean, there's so many problems within philanthropy that prevent philanthropy from actually long-term doing this work in a genuine way. So I think that it's dependent on people inside of the institutions and people outside of the institutions. The good news is that I saw there are warriors inside of every space. But it's like the racial equity statements, like none of them meant anything. Very few of them meant anything. But we're starting to see places that are distinguishing themselves. And I will tell you about Skillman Foundation. I was at the Field Foundation when I was doing this work. But at Skillman, we just studied these words, racial equity and racial justice, which are overused and completely not understood at all. And we just finished a racial equity audit, which we shared with the board and staff. We haven't shared externally, but we will. We looked at where every penny inside of our foundation goes, from the operations to the endowment to the grants. And we will be sharing that publicly so that people can hold us accountable and hold others accountable. So I think we actually need to get on top of some of the structural issues inside of philanthropy before we can assume that sustainable changes will happen.
There may be folks in the audience who would love to see this work where they live. If there are any foundation people here or connections to the philanthropic world, what advice would you give for people who would like to see this replicated in their own communities?
This is really easy to do. All of this information exists in every community. It's really just having like a researcher to dynamically pull it together, and then having a non-researcher to say, like, that is way too complicated. Nobody is going to understand those maps unless they're really clean and clear. And so we actually have shared this in different places, and we've seen other places adopt this as a really quick way to tell the story of like how we got to 2020 and to start planning how we can get from 2020.
And I feel like it took just a few of us to say we're willing to be transparent. I mean, again, transparency has always been part of our ethos since we began about 12 years ago now, about the organizations we invest in, outcomes, et cetera. We are as transparent as we can try to be, and that's just been part of our model. And sharing. So even in the Emergency Relief Fund, we had, I think it was over 700 different applicants, which we did an extremely quick process. You could literally call us to get your applications in, which was different for us. But my point was we vetted quickly as many as we could. We only had a certain amount of dollars, like every philanthropy, to get out the door. We did that and then shared a zip file with all of the people as part of the COVID mapping, every colleague we knew in philanthropy saying, here are incredible hundreds of organizations looking for dollars. We're out of emergency relief money. But I mean, that's something in the past we hadn't done. So we started to build some of that muscle as a community. But it really took a few of us saying, let's start putting our data together on where our investments go. And then quite frankly, it then became more and more foundations felt like the pressure to do, so that's odd. Why aren't you sending your data? And if we're all trying to collectively help the city in this moment in time, it became odd not to share your data at some point. There was a tipping point. So I think it takes just a few folks to really get this rolling. And as Angelique said, data's available, a lot of it publicly.
And while the data is available, I think another point that I think Angelique just alluded to is the internal side of philanthropy and how it must also reflect the demographics of our country. When we take a look at the boards of foundations, are we getting boards representing BIPOC communities, the staff with decision-making positions of foundations? So I think that we're getting to have some representation. We certainly have some strong allies, but it's really important that we continue to have representation across the board in philanthropy.
How have these maps pushed you to reimagine what public health, or let's say even housing, education, any social issue, how have the maps pushed you to reimagine what these areas could look like?
You could, when we look at these maps, and going back to the maps that we started pre-pandemic times at the Healthy Communities Foundation, when we were rebranding the foundation's approach, and perhaps the city of Chicago and suburban communities happen to be so easy because of our segregated communities, or the fact that we have various neighborhoods across the region. So it's fairly easy to show a racial lens. But what we did was we looked at just there's a Stevenson I-55 that runs across our county or the region, and if you went south, we could see how the lack of institutions that were invested in. So the fact is that we knew before the pandemic the lack of institutions that were present to address, whether we're looking at school systems, when we were looking at health services. Anything below I-55 in the region was almost null. And so we knew that it existed. I think it's more of, are we willing to understand the importance of investing in these communities for the long haul is a true issue. The maps are there, whether it's in Chicago, whether it's in New York, whether it's Atlanta. You could go across and do the maps anywhere in this country and show the lack of investments that have created systemic inequities. Are we willing to go 5 years after this pandemic and have something else be that match to light up another issue?
Well, I'll say three things really quickly. Data is sexy. I did not know that. I really didn't.
You say sexy or sassy?
Sexy.
Okay.
It is sexy. It is the hack. It is accountability. It is transparency. And there are a lot of people working on how to, it seems banal, and they're working on doing consistently having the same questions we're asking, but it's actually gonna change so many things. So I love data. Systems are interconnected, and the interoperability between systems is part of what needs to be fixed. So at Skillman, we focus on education systems, which are inextricably linked to economic systems. And so what's in the classroom is impacted by the economic conditions outside of the classrooms. That's it. So you can't just do one thing and expect outcomes. And then finally, give money to people and moonwalk away. Just give money to people and get out of the way.
They want cash. They want the
Yeah.
money, not have to fill out a bunch
Yeah.
of metric reports.
Right. Yeah. And so we give unrestricted dollars and then additional dollars to actually help people scale and grow. As they hit issues along the way of trying to reach more children, we are a partner. We bring in more dollars, a strategic consultant. We're there so it's unrestricted capital, and then we will help you get to where you want to go, not where we want you to go. I would say also to your original question, we also view our work as if we're able to invest in those study areas with some incredible organizations and leaders, they can become proof points to then hopefully leverage larger dollars. I mean, philanthropy can only do so much. We only have, and these issues are so complex that we eventually need public dollars to flow to those areas and public dollars to change. And so one thing we're trying to think through as an organization, how to utilize our platform, these incredible leaders and organizations that we're investing in supporting, but then amplify their work to hopefully really leverage major change systems, public dollars, et cetera. I think that's really the end game.
I'd like to turn it over to questions. We have a mic in the middle of the room. If you could stand up and ask it and introduce yourself, please.
My name's Andy. I'm with the Housing Authority of the City of Austin. And in lieu of those, short-term cash infusions that, really can't address the long-standing systemic issues and the expedited tranches of funding that we were just talking about, that really won't continue in philanthropy. Well, how can philanthropy at least continue to invest in organizational recovery, preparedness, and systems transformation for future crises, and in turn help organizations, especially smaller or growing or devastated organizations, build capacity and resilience? And it's not just talking about foundations, putting out general operating support, but it's, those funds are strained now, or specific program development grant opportunities, as more as those that are concentrated on strengthening the organizations in and of themselves. I mean, you saw a lot of them, really staff up, and it's now it's time to cool their jets, but at the same time, we're not over.
Thanks for that question, and I love Boston. What a great city. What we were hearing from our grantee partners, we did a survey of many of our grantee partners right during COVID, asking them, well, what will it take for a recovery, for coming back even stronger? And what we heard was general operating and multi-year support, knowing that we can depend on funding coming in and that we can plan for it. And while, as Beth alluded to earlier, philanthropy cannot do this alone. It will take government funding as well. Philanthropy can be there for planning, be there for taking risks, and certainly be there to ensure that you are able to know that for 3 years, for 5 years down the road, you can depend on this support. But we kept hearing general operating multi-year. That's what we heard.
Yeah, I would say we heard similarly that as well. Yeah.
I think you're also, I think you're asking for in addition to that. Is that what you're saying? Yeah.
The question is, a lot of foundations are starting to see general operating support
Yeah.
As opposed to, well, no, there's a reason that, or there's something to be said about investing in organizations in and of themselves in light of the pandemic as they address social inequities that are exacerbated during the pandemic. How we strengthen them and help funders realize that this is not just general operating support because we want to,
Like it's still recovery dollars. Recovery dollars are going to be needed for years, and that's important to set aside money for, but that's also different than like reimagining dollars, that's important to set aside money for. I think what you're lifting is a good conversation to continue. Yeah.
Hi there, my name is Wells Hutchison. I live in Wrigleyville. I'm the CEO of Delta Dental Plans Association, which is the association of the Delta Dental member companies. I think one of our biggest weaknesses in Chicago is the segregation. There's an index that's been used, I've read about it, in one of the most segregated cities in the country, which I think leads to poor mental health, physical health, economic development. If you had a huge endowment and an army of people to carry out the mission of ending segregation, or at least making it a little less than it currently is in Chicago, how would you go about that?
I don't even think it's money related. I think if you look at Chicago, you look at, 50 wards, 50 aldermen, many mayors all over the city who have restrictive, covenants and aldermanic prerogative that stop people from moving in. And so I actually think it's a policy play all the way, and they're starting to do that. They removed aldermanic privilege so that they can't continue on the north side and in the Gold Coast to stop people of color basically from moving into those neighborhoods. But if money solved it, then MacArthur would have solved it a long time ago. So I think we've got to have a policy play too.
I'll just add really quickly that in Chicago, I think that the policing conversation takes up the energy out of the room. I'm not saying that there should not be critiques. There are a lot of really, and as a reporter, I'm covering what's happening in the housing department and planning and development. And it's going to take decades to reverse some of these policies, but there's a lot of really interesting, equitable work that is going on that doesn't, I'm probably the only reporter reporting on those things because, CPS and CPD is where the attention is, but it's really non-sexy zoning, low-income housing tax credits. But you would be so interested in what's happening. I can, but it's a whole bunch of, it's like 100 little things that have to happen in those departments. And, and I know I said I'd be quick, but the downtown people in Chicago are not happy with the mayor because the investment, Invest Southwest. So there is a lot of, you could argue that it's not enough. And again, it would take many administrations to make things equitable, but those are the two agencies where that work really begins. And we're almost, we can keep going. I want to be respectful of people's time, so have at it.
Hopefully this is short. Hi, my name is Rachel Goslins, and I'm on the board of the Greater Washington Community Foundation, which covers Washington, D.C. and proximate Maryland and Virginia counties. And we're currently looking at place-based, sort of hyper-local investment strategies. So I'm really interested in your data mapping project, and I'm wondering whether, as you thought about the layers of the map that you were overlaying, whether you thought about looking at capacity in these communities, whether by number of applications you had or number of nonprofits or community organizations in that area, efficacy of local governments or city councils, as you're thinking about driving investment and what you're investing in, I was wondering if you looked at capacity at all.
No, not really. I think what we looked at was how are we limiting applications to fund social impact as it happens in those communities? Are we looking at a certain size and structure? Are we looking at a nonprofit? How does change actually happen in these communities, and how do we catch up with it so that we get dollars to support it? So I think that's a lot of the investment strategy. It's like the foundation has to change, not people have been doing this work without money for a really long time. And so I think we put up a lot of barriers to have them prove to us that they can handle our money. But it's like, they can handle our money, we can give them money, let's just give them money.
And we'll take this one last question. Thank you.
Hi, hello there. My name is Leila Hanami, so I have an interpreter here voicing for me. I work with Communication Services for the Deaf, Unity's Community Foundation, and we're a fairly new foundation, and we focus primarily on doing grants, making them accessible to Deaf Central nonprofits. So I was wondering if you perhaps have any experience with pooling or matching funds and having those opportunities with other foundations, due to the fact that we feel that there are a lot of foundations, just like you guys said, who are just suddenly interested in supporting or investing in marginalized communities. Perhaps you might be interested in accessibility facets as well, but we don't know if they actually understand what it actually takes to make grants accessible for the deaf community. So we thought that one good opportunity would be to partner with your foundations, because we do have that expertise that we bring to the table. So I'm just wondering if that's something that you have experience or advice on that you can give in that area.
I just want to make sure I'm clear on the question. Was a question around pulling funds specifically, and having experience on pulling funds to assist with your approach. Yeah, I'm certainly folks.
Yes, or just a partnership, partnering with other foundations.
Okay. Well, I mentioned our foundation. We're not a huge foundation, and while we are relatively considered a mid-sized foundation, even those dollars alone would not be enough to address the needs of our region. And so partnership is really key in philanthropy. But I would say that even pre-pandemic times, the pulling of funds was sometimes to fund things that were on the social determinants of health or structural determinants of health that weren't necessarily seen as, ooh, that's not health. So we would pull funds together and create a project or into a pooled funding approach to address that. And while that was needed pre-pandemic times, I would say, now it's more from the spirit of, we know we need to work together collaboratively. We're part of after the COVID fund in the Chicago area, there was a fund that was pooled together to look at, there were organizations that were doing some really innovative work, and we said, what would it take to put some more funding aside just for innovation? That was called the Health First Fund. So the pooled dollars that are there are solely specifically for taking risks. So as we think about investments for 401ks or your own investment portfolio, you might have conservative funds, you might have traditional funds, and then you have your risky funds. Now, we see that it's really important for us to think about our communities as that type of portfolio. We should be willing to put money in to take risks. And in those approaches, I think pooled funds are really important to get more resources in for those creative opportunities that are there that could then become supported. I don't know if that's one example of pooled funds that were created.
Can I just say about accessibility that all foundations need help with accessibility. All foundations do. And so I think, partnering with foundations to help translate opportunities to a wider community. We didn't share slides around disability and how that's impacted by COVID, but that is a part of the mapping project. But I think philanthropy would benefit from a partnership like what you're discussing.
Agreed, and I'll just add 2 examples. We're partnering more and more with other foundations. We've got 2. One is the McCormick Foundation, which is a large foundation in Chicago, but we actually have our team, although maybe smaller, we have a lot of expertise around some post-secondary work in nonprofits, and so they don't have a team that's devoted to that work. So they leverage us, our team, and we do matching dollars. So we sort of do the philanthropic work, but McCormick flows additional dollars to some incredible organizations that we have found and fund and support. And same thing with the Blackhawks. So the Blackhawks professional sports team in the NHL, and they are embedded on the west side of Chicago. They wanted more of a presence there in the community. They wanted to be supporting young people in the community. We already have, like I mentioned, the Catalyst Fund focused on our south and west sides. So what they did is rather than try to create an apparatus that they didn't have internally, they partnered with us, and we have a One West Side initiative, and they are matching our dollars going to West Side organizations serving young people. And so we know we're just leveraging more dollars for young people and having an incredible impact now on the West Side because of the Blackhawks' additional dollars. But you know, the collective power of the partnership is going further than we could have ever gone by ourselves. So just two examples that, and I think more of that, you know, will be happening over the next few years as well.
Thank you all for staying past 5 o'clock. I appreciate it, and thank you, Beth, Angelique, and Maria.